Hey guys, tonight we're heading back, way back, to a time when the very idea of a weekend, let alone a long weekend, would have been as alien as a smartphone or a self-driving chariot. We're drifting down the dusty plains of Mesopotamia to the heart of ancient Sumer, the cradle of what we call civilization. Imagine yourself surrounded by vast reed marshes shimmering under a relentless sun, the air thick with the smell of damp earth, river water, and the distant smoke of cooking fires. This is where it all began. Cities, writing, laws, and yes, the very first attempts to organize time itself with a calendar. But as brilliant as the Sumerians were, as foundational as their inventions are to our own lives, there's one little modern convenience they never quite seem to nail: the glorious work-free weekend. You probably wouldn't survive this ancient world without a good understanding of irrigation canals, a healthy respect for unpredictable river gods who apparently didn't believe in 5-day flood warnings, and absolutely no expectation of a 2-day break to binge-watch cuneiform soap operas. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as always, I'd love to know where you're all tuning in from as we embark on this ancient, time-bending adventure. Feel free to share your location and local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in southern Mesopotamia, a vast, flat, fertile plain nestled between the mighty Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This is Sumer, the land that, starting around the 4th millennium BCE, witnessed the birth of some of the world's earliest cities, places with evocative names like Eridu, Uruk, Lagash, and Nippur. The landscape here is a study in contrasts. Away from the life-giving rivers, the land can be harsh, arid, prone to scorching heat in the summer months. But along the riverbanks and in the extensive marshlands where the rivers spread out before reaching the Persian Gulf, life flourishes. Reeds grow thick and tall, providing building materials and shelter for myriad birds and small animals. Date palms offer precious shade and even more precious sweet fruit. The rivers themselves are the lifeblood, bringing not just water but also, during their often unpredictable annual floods, a fresh deposit of incredibly fertile silt that renews the land. They are also major transportation routes, with simple reed boats and perhaps more substantial wooden vessels gliding along their currents, carrying goods and people between settlements. The air you breathe is warm, often heavy with humidity near the rivers and marshes. The scent of wet mud is pervasive, a constant reminder of the earth from which everything here is built. The Sumerians were masters of mud brick architecture. With little stone available on the vast alluvial plain, sun-dried mud bricks were the primary building material for everything from humble dwellings to towering ziggurats, those massive stepped temple platforms that dominated their cityscapes. Imagine the look of these early cities' clusters of flat-roofed, mud brick houses, packed closely together. Their walls a dusty brown or perhaps whitewashed with gypsum plaster to reflect some of the intense sunlight. The streets would be narrow, unpaved, likely bustling with people, domestic animals like goats and donkeys, and the general clamor of early urban life. You might hear the cries of vendors, the bleating of sheep, the murmur of Sumerian voices speaking a language unlike any other we know, its origins still a mystery. It's a world built of earth and water, under a vast, often unforgiving sky. You definitely want to invest in a good, wide-brimmed reed hat, and maybe some of that ancient crocodile dung sunscreen we've talked about on other sleepy journeys, though its efficacy is, shall we say, historically debatable. This is where civilization, as we often define it, truly begins to awaken. Sumer, located in southern Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, is widely considered the earliest known civilization, emerging in the 4th millennium BCE, and was responsible for many foundational innovations, including the invention of writing in the form of cuneiform script on clay tablets, the wheel at least, its application for pottery and vehicles, large-scale irrigation, monumental architecture like ziggurats, and the development of the city-state as a political entity. It's a period of incredible human ingenuity and social transformation. People are transitioning from smaller, scattered agricultural villages to larger, more densely populated urban centers, Labor is becoming more specialized. No longer is everyone just a farmer or a hunter. Now you have priests, scribes, potters, metalworkers, builders, merchants, and, of course, rulers and administrators. This increasing complexity of society, this move towards larger, more organized communities, is precisely what will create the need for a more structured understanding of time. You can't run a city, manage temple estates, or organize large-scale irrigation projects based on just when the sun feels high or when the birds fly south. You need a system. You need a calendar. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Sumerian mythology is filled with stories reflecting their environment and their origins. Their creation myths often speak of primordial beings emerging from the watery abyss. The Abzu, which was believed to lie beneath the earth, a concept likely inspired by the vast marshes and the ever-present groundwater of southern Mesopotamia. Gods and goddesses were associated with the forces of nature that so dominated their lives. The sky god An, the air god Enlil, the earth goddess Ninhursag, the water god Enki, and, as we'll see, the moon god Nena, who played a crucial role in their early attempts at timekeeping. These weren't distant, abstract deities. They were intimately involved in the daily struggles and triumphs of Sumerian life, particularly the struggle to bring order out of the chaos of nature. Trying to get planning permission for a new ziggurat from Enlil, who was also known for causing rather destructive floods when displeased, must have been a bureaucratic nightmare involving many omens and probably a lot of well-placed offerings. Are you sure the god of wind and storms wants his temple facing that way during flood season? Chief architect? The precise origins of the Sumerian people themselves, whether they were indigenous to southern Mesopotamia, having lived there since time immemorial, or migrated from elsewhere, perhaps from the east or north, bringing their unique language and culture with them, remains a subject of ongoing scholarly debate and linguistic analysis. Their language, Sumerian, is a linguistic isolate, meaning it has no known relatives, which only adds to the mystery. What is clear is that by around 3500 BCE, they had established a vibrant and innovative culture that would lay the groundwork for much of what followed in Mesopotamian history, and indeed, world history. Their fashion sense, by the way, was probably all about mud brick chic and practical. Breathable linen, given the climate. Not a lot of room for elaborate Gore-Tex or an ancient Sumer. So, as you settle into this ancient landscape, feel the dry heat on your skin. Hear the distant lapping of river water against reed banks, and see the first glimmerings of urban life taking shape around you. Remember that you are at a pivotal point in human history. These people, the Sumerians, are about to embark on a journey of discovery, not just of new lands or new technologies, but of time itself. They are driven by a fundamental human need, the need for order, for predictability, for a way to make sense of the world and their place within its grand, unfolding cycles. And that need will lead them to gaze at the heavens, to count the days, and to invent the very first calendars. Even if, as we'll explore, they never quite managed to invent the concept of a lazy Saturday morning. You are now immersed in the nascent world of Sumer, a land of fertile silt, life-giving rivers, and burgeoning city-states. The sun beats down, the reeds whisper in the marshes, and the first mud brick ziggurats are beginning to pierce the flat horizon. Life here is becoming increasingly complex, moving beyond the simpler rhythms of small agricultural villages. And with this growing complexity comes a growing, pressing need, the need for order, for a way to structure and understand the passage of time. Why did these ancient Sumerians, so busy with the fundamental tasks of building a civilization from the ground up, literally, from mud, first bother to count the days, to track the seasons, to invent the very concept of a calendar? The answer, as with so many human innovations, lies in a confluence of practical necessities and spiritual imperatives. It wasn't an academic exercise, it was essential for their survival, their prosperity, and their relationship with the powerful, often capricious gods they worshipped. For a society transitioning from predominantly hunter-gatherer lifestyles, though some of that, like fishing and fowling, certainly continued to settled agriculture on a large scale, understanding time became paramount. The development of agriculture in Mesopotamia, with its reliance on seasonal crops like barley and wheat, necessitated a more precise understanding of the passage of time for successful planting and harvesting, thus driving early calendrical developments. You couldn't just plant your barley whenever you felt like it and hope for the best. You needed to know when the danger of the last frost had passed, though frosts were rare in southern Sumer. Unseasonal cold snaps could occur, when the soil was ready, when the river floods were most likely to bring their vital water and silt, or conversely, when they might bring destructive inundation, and crucially, when to expect the harvest before it spoiled in the field or was devoured by pests. Missing these crucial windows by even a few weeks could mean the difference between abundance and starvation for an entire community. The Sumerian farmer, looking out over his fields of swaying grain, needed a reliable way to anticipate the rhythms of the agricultural year. He needed a calendar. Imagine trying to coordinate a communal planting effort without one. All right, everyone, we plant when that one specific date palm over there gets its third new frond on the west side. Or was it the east, and which palm again? Chaos. Then there were the religious and ritual needs. Sumerian society was deeply religious. Their worldview was permeated by the presence of powerful gods and goddesses who controlled every aspect of nature and human life. The sky, the earth, the water, storms, fertility, even the success of your beer brewing. Appeasing these deities through regular offerings, sacrifices, and festivals was considered absolutely essential for the well-being of the community. And these rituals often had to be performed at specific, auspicious times, times dictated by celestial events, seasonal changes, or mythical precedents. You couldn't just hold the festival for Inanna, the goddess of love and war, whenever you had a free afternoon. It had to align with her sacred cycles, or the agricultural events she governed. The temples, which were not just places of worship, but also major economic and administrative centers, played a crucial role here. Temple priests were among the first specialists in observing the heavens, interpreting divine will, and, consequently, managing the ritual calendar. They needed to know when to prepare for major festivals, when to make specific offerings, when to perform the rites that ensured the continued favor of the gods and the smooth running of the cosmos. A mistimed festival could be a cosmic faux pas of epic proportions, potentially resulting in divine displeasure, which no one wanted. Did anyone remember if the great reed cutting ceremony for Enki is this new moon or the next one? He gets awfully tetchy about his reeds being cut at the wrong time. Remember the Great Flood of 2800 BCE? That was awkward. Beyond agriculture and religion, the burgeoning civic and administrative needs of the growing Sumerian city-states also demanded a more structured approach to time. As populations grew and societies became more organized, there was a need to coordinate large-scale communal activities. Think of the construction of ziggurats, those massive temple towers that required an immense mobilization of labor and resources over extended periods, or the digging and maintenance of complex irrigation canals, essential for agriculture in a land with inconsistent rainfall. These projects needed planning, scheduling, and a way to measure the duration of work and the allocation of rations to laborers. Some of the earliest cuneiform tablets ever discovered, dating back to the Uruk period around 3200 BCE, are precisely these kinds of texts, administrative and economic records dealing with the distribution of rations beer, bread, oil, the counting of livestock, the allocation of land, and the management of labor. Such record-keeping inherently implies some form of time organization, even if it was initially just a simple count of days or months for a particular project or accounting period. Legal contracts and economic transactions also benefit immensely from a shared understanding of time. If you lend someone a quantity of barley, you need to agree on when it will be repaid. If you hire a laborer, you need to specify the duration of their service. While early Sumerian contracts might have used less precise terms until the next harvest. For 3 full moons, the development of a more formal calendar would have provided a much clearer and more enforceable framework for these agreements. Before they developed a more systematic calendar, the Sumerians, like all early peoples, would have relied on simple, direct observations of nature to mark the passage of time on a larger scale. They would watch the sun's daily journey across the sky, its changing rising and setting points on the horizon throughout the year, the varying length of daylight, They would observe the seasonal changes in plant life, the budding of trees, the ripening of fruits, the dying back of vegetation. The migration patterns of birds or the behavior of other animals would also provide clues. And at night, they would look to the stars, noticing the slow, grand procession of constellations across the celestial sphere, certain star groups becoming visible or disappearing at particular times of the year, heralding the onset of different seasons. These were nature's own timekeepers. But while reliable in a general sense, they lacked the precision and predictability needed for the increasingly complex demands of Sumerian society. The sun might tell you it's summer, but it wouldn't tell you if it was the first day of the third month, which might be when your temple tax of 3 sheep was due. It was this growing realization that their existing informal methods of timekeeping were no longer sufficient for their evolving agricultural, religious, and administrative needs that pushed the Sumerians towards a more deliberate, systematic attempt to measure, record, and predict the passage of time. They needed order, they needed structure, they needed a calendar. Whether the primary impetus for early calendrical development in Sumer was driven more by agricultural necessity knowing when to plant and harvest, by religious ritual requirements, timing festivals and offerings correctly, or by the administrative needs of burgeoning temple and state bureaucracies managing labor, resources, and records is a topic of ongoing discussion among Assyriologists and historians of science. It was likely a combination of all these factors, each reinforcing the others, pushing them to look to the heavens for a more reliable clock, and the first, most obvious, and most mesmerizing celestial body they turned to was the moon. Our next stop on this sleepy journey into the heart of ancient time. The Sumerian farmers probably had intense debates about whose turn it was to use the only communal water clock, likely just a carefully perforated leaky pot, to time their irrigation shifts. Enmerkar, you let the pot run dry again? My barley is going to look like your beard if this keeps up. You're standing on the flat plains of Sumer, the night air surprisingly cool after the day's relentless heat. Above you, the sky is a vast, dark canopy, unpolluted by modern city lights, and a breathtaking panorama of stars on TV blazing, with an intensity rarely seen today. But it's not just the myriad stars that capture your attention, and that of the ancient Sumerians beside you. It's the moon, that silvery disk, or perhaps a slender crescent, hanging in the darkness, cycling through its phases with a regularity that is both mysterious and deeply comforting. For a society seeking to bring order to their understanding of time, the moon was the most obvious, the most accessible, and the most compelling celestial clock. Let's watch with these early moon gazers as they begin to unravel its rhythms and lay the very first foundations of a calendar. Imagine a Sumerian priest, or perhaps just a curious farmer, stepping out of their mud brick dwelling night after night. Looking up, what would they see? They would see the moon appear as a delicate sliver, a bright fingernail clipping in the western sky just after sunset. The new moon, night by night. This crescent would grow, waxing, becoming a half moon, then a gibbous moon, until finally, it swelled into a glorious, luminous full moon, flooding the landscape with its pale, ethereal light. This full moon would have been a significant event, a beacon in the darkness, perhaps a time for special observances or simply a welcome period of increased nocturnal visibility. Then, just as predictably, the moon would begin to wane, shrinking night by night through its gibbous and half-moon phases, until it became a fading crescent in the eastern sky before dawn, eventually disappearing altogether for a few nights before the cycle began anew with the reappearance of that first slender sliver. This entire, easily observable cycle, from one new moon or first visible crescent to the next, takes approximately 29.5 days. That, for the Sumerians, became the basis of their month. Indeed, our very word month is etymologically derived from moon. It was a natural unit of time, far more manageable and predictable for short-term planning than the vast, slow sweep of the solar year. You could count the lunar cycles with relative ease. The river should flood around the time of the third full moon after the barley is planted. Or, my debt to the temple is due 2 moons from now. It provided a rhythm, a beat to their lives. Most early calendar systems around the world, including those in Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and pre-Columbian America, were initially based on the cycles of the moon lunar calendars, precisely because the moon's phases are so conspicuous and provide a readily discernible unit of time. The moon, or Nana, as the Sumerians called him, later known as Suen or Sin by the Akkadians and Babylonians, was not just a celestial timekeeper. He was a major deity in their pantheon. Nana was the son of Enlil, the powerful god of air and storms, and Ninlil, the grain goddess. He was often associated with wisdom, with the fertility of cattle, his crescent horns perhaps resembling those of a bull, with the measuring of time, and even with the art of writing, as his cycles provided a basis for order and record-keeping. His chief cult center was the great city of Ur, where a magnificent ziggurat, a stepped temple tower, was dedicated to him, its imposing form rising above the surrounding plain, a man-made mountain reaching towards the celestial realm of the moon god himself. You can imagine the priests of Nana at Ur, their lives dedicated to observing his nightly journey, performing the rituals in his honor, and perhaps being among the first to systematically record his cycles. Religious festivals and observances would have been closely tied to the lunar phases. The appearance of the new crescent moon each month was likely a significant event, a moment of renewal, perhaps marked by special ceremonies or a cessation of certain types of work. The full moon, with its bright light banishing the deepest darkness, might also have been a time for particular rituals or celebrations. These recurring lunar events provided a framework for the religious life of the community, ensuring that the gods were honored at the proper intervals. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Sumerian hymns to Nana often describe him poetically sailing across the night sky in a celestial boat, his crescent form imagined as the gleaming hull of a divine vessel, or sometimes as a shepherd guiding his starry flock. This beautiful imagery connects their riverine culture, where boats were essential to their careful observations of the night sky, and highlights the reverence they held for their lunar deity. Look, children, a Sumerian mother might say, pointing to the waxing crescent. Nana is launching his silver boat tonight. Let's hope he brings fair tides and keeps the river monsters away. The very first calendars developed by the Sumerians were likely simple counts of these lunar months. They would observe the first sliver of the new moon, declare the beginning of a new month, and then count the days perhaps 29 or 30 until the next new moon appeared. They would give names to these months, often linked to agricultural activities that typically occurred during that period: month of plowing, month of reaping barley, or to major religious festivals dedicated to specific deities. These named lunar months provided a shared framework for organizing communal life, for scheduling agricultural tasks, for planning religious ceremonies, and for recording economic transactions. Clay tablets from this period, inscribed with a distinctive wedge-shaped cuneiform script, begin to show records that include month names, indicating the growing importance of this lunar-based timekeeping system. The task of officially observing the new moon and declaring the start of a new month likely fell to specialized temple personnel. The priests are perhaps dedicated sky watchers. Yaisane, the precise methods used by the earliest Sumerians to determine the exact beginning of a new lunar month. Whether it was purely by the first visual sighting of the thin crescent after sunset, which could be affected by weather conditions or the observer's keenness of sight, by some form of rudimentary calculation based on the previous month's length, or by a combination of both observation and prediction, and how consistently this was applied across different cities in Sumer, is not definitively known from the earliest surviving texts. It's likely there was some local variation and perhaps a degree of official pronouncement involved. Imagine the anticipation. Has anyone seen Nana's sliver yet? The beer for the new moon festival is almost ready, and the temple musicians are getting restless. So, as you gaze up at that ancient Sumerian night sky, feel the profound connection these early people had with the moon. It was their first clock, their first calendar page, a divine guide, and a source of wonder and poetry. Its steady, predictable rhythm brought a semblance of order to their lives, a way to measure the flow of time in a world that was still full of untamed forces and divine mysteries. But as we'll soon discover, while the moon was a beautiful and reliable guide for the month, Its rhythm didn't quite dance in perfect harmony with the longer, more crucial rhythm of the sun and the seasons. And that moon wobble would lead to some tricky calendrical challenges. You're now comfortably nestled in ancient Sumer, where the moon, the shining god Nana, has become the primary timekeeper, his cyclical journey through the night sky dividing time into manageable monthly parcels. This lunar calendar, with its named months pegged to the reappearance of the new crescent, brought a new level of order to agricultural planning, religious festivals, and civic administration. It was a significant intellectual achievement, a testament to careful observation and the human desire to understand and structure the world. However, as the Sumerians continued to diligently track these lunar cycles, season after season, year after year, a subtle but persistent problem would have begun to emerge, a kind of celestial wobble in their timekeeping system. The moon, for all its beauty and regularity on a monthly scale, doesn't quite march in perfect step with the sun and the all-important agricultural seasons that the sun governs. This growing discrepancy would present the Sumerians with their next great calendrical headache. Let's delve into the heart of this moon wobble. As we know, a true lunar month, the synodic period, or the time from one new moon to the next, is approximately 29.53 days long. The Sumerians, like most early calendar makers, would have approximated this by alternating months of 29 days and 30 days to try and keep pace, or by simply declaring a new month when the new crescent was sighted. If you take 12 of these lunar months to make a year, you end up with a year that is approximately 354 days long. Slash 29.5, he's 354. So far, so good. If all you care about is counting moons. But here's the rub. The solar year, which is the time it takes for the Earth to complete one full orbit around the sun, and which dictates the actual cycle of the seasons spring, summer, autumn, winter, is approximately 365.25 days long. So, the purely lunar year of 354 days is about 11 days shorter than the solar year. It doesn't sound like much, does it? Just 11 little days? But these 11 days, accumulating year after year, would cause the lunar calendar to drift significantly out of sync with the seasons. It's like having a watch that consistently loses a few minutes every day. Eventually, it's telling you it's lunchtime when it's actually time for bed, or in the Sumerians' case, telling them it's the month of reaping barley when the barley is still just a tiny green shoot, or worse, like when there's still a distinct chill in the air from the previous winter. But the calendar clearly states it's time for the great sunbathing festival of Utu. A Sumerian might exclaim, shivering in an unseasonable cold snap. Someone tell Utu his festival is on, even if he forgot to bring the actual sun. Imagine the consequences of this accumulating drift for an agricultural society like Sumer. Their month names, as we've learned, were often tied to specific agricultural activities or seasonal phenomena. The month when barley is sown. The month of the spring harvest. The month of the summer heat. If their lunar calendar drifted by 11 days each year, then, after just 3 years, it would be out of sync with the solar seasons by about 33 days, more than a full month. After 9 years, it would be off by nearly 100 days, almost a third of a year. This means that the month of plowing, which should ideally occur in a specific cool, moist part of the year, would gradually creep earlier and earlier, eventually falling in the scorching heat of summer or the depths of winter such as they were in southern Mesopotamia. Planting crops based on a month name that no longer corresponded to the correct agricultural season would lead to failed harvests and potential famine. Religious festivals, too, often tied to specific seasonal events like the first fruits or the grain harvest, would become detached from their original meaning and purpose, celebrated at entirely the wrong time of year. This would not only be confusing but potentially offensive to the gods, who were presumably expecting their sacred cheesecake at the actual harvest festival, not 3 months later when all the good cheesecake ingredients were out of season. The Sumerians, being keen observers of their environment, would undoubtedly have become aware of this moon wobble, or this relentless seasonal drift. It wouldn't have been an immediate, dramatic revelation, but a slowly dawning, frustrating realization. The elders might recall that in their youth, A particular festival always coincided with the hottest days, but now their grandchildren were celebrating it when there was still a nip in the air. Scribes keeping temple records of harvests and offerings over many years would have noticed the dates slowly but surely marching out of step with the observable realities of the agricultural cycle. This discrepancy, this failure of their elegant lunar system to stay true to the deeper rhythm of the seasons, must have been a source of considerable concern and likely much learned debate among the priests and proto-astronomers of the time. The discrepancy between the lunar year approximately 354 days and the solar year approximately 365.25 days is a fundamental problem that all societies attempting to create a functional calendar based on both cycles have had to address throughout history. It's a mathematical inconvenience built into the very fabric of our solar system, a cosmic puzzle that many brilliant minds have grappled with. The Sumerians were among the very first to encounter it in a systematic way as they tried to build an ordered society. What were their early attempts to deal with this initially? They might have simply ignored the drift for short periods, especially if its effects were not immediately catastrophic. Or they might have made occasional ad hoc corrections when the discrepancy became too glaring to ignore. Perhaps a wise ruler or a council of priests would declare that a particular month needed to be held back, or an extra unnamed period of days inserted to try and nudge the calendar back into alignment with the seasons. This, however, would be a reactive rather than a proactive solution, leading to uncertainty and potential disruption. It's the ancient equivalent of constantly having to manually reset your clocks because none of them quite agree. The boring trial and error of ancient science at its finest. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some cuneiform tablets known as hemerologies or menologies list auspicious and inauspicious days within each month. Days favorable for certain activities like starting a journey or building a house, and days when it was best to lie low and avoid important undertakings. The unreliability of a purely lunar calendar, with its constant drift against the seasons, would make long-term planning for these good or bad days increasingly problematic if those activities were also seasonally dependent. Imagine planning a favorable day for planting, only to find that day now falls in the middle of a drought because the calendar has drifted so far. The omen on the sheep's liver said today was perfect for sowing. It didn't say anything about the field being a dust bowl. How quickly and systematically Sumerian scribes or priests recognized and quantified the precise amount of drift of the purely lunar calendar against the solar seasonal year is a matter of careful interpretation. As the earliest cuneiform records are often administrative or economic in nature, rather than overtly scientific or astronomical treatises in the modern sense, the knowledge was likely built up gradually through generations of observation, record keeping, and perhaps some rather heated debates in temple courtyards. I tell you, Enheduanna, the barley harvest month is definitely trying to escape into spring again. We need to add more days, or Nana is going to be very confused about when his sacred mooncakes are due. This growing awareness of the lunar calendar's shortcomings, its inability to reliably predict the seasons crucial for agriculture and religious life, would have pushed the Sumerians to look for a more stable anchor for their year. Their gaze would increasingly turn towards the sun, the ultimate arbiter of the seasons, and to the fixed patterns of the stars, which provided an even more reliable map of the solar year. The moon, their first love in timekeeping, was proving to be a bit too flighty for a long-term relationship. A more dependable partner was needed to keep their world in sync, and that, as we'll see, would lead them to the ingenious, if sometimes complicated, solution of the lunisolar calendar. The Sumerians, as we've seen, were astute observers of the night sky, and their early attempts at timekeeping were beautifully guided by the gentle, cyclical glow of the moon, their god Nana. However, that lovely lunar rhythm, with its months of roughly 29 or 30 days, had a fundamental flaw. It stubbornly refused to align with the longer, more crucial cycle of the solar year, the one that dictated the seasons, the floods, the planting, and the harvest. Their lunar calendar was constantly wobbling out of sync, causing agricultural chaos and ritualistic confusion. It became increasingly clear that while the moon was an excellent marker for shorter periods, they needed another celestial guide, a more steadfast anchor, to truly master the art of the calendar. And that guide, inevitably, was the sun, the brilliant god Utu or Shamash in Akkadian, whose steady beat truly governed life on Earth. So, you can imagine the Sumerian priests and sky watchers, perhaps a little frustrated with Nana's temporal fickleness, now turning their gaze more intently towards Utu's daily and annual journey. They would have been acutely aware of the sun's paramount importance. It brought light, it brought warmth, often in Mesopotamia, a little too much warmth, and its apparent movement across the sky and its changing position on the horizon throughout the year were the ultimate drivers of the seasons. While the moon's phases were easy to track for defining months, it was the sun's journey that held the key to understanding the year. All right, Nana, you handled the monthly billing cycle. The chief temple astronomer might have declared, Utu, you're in charge of the fiscal year and all major agricultural holidays. Try to coordinate. Please, we're tired of harvesting imaginary barley in the middle of dust storm season. What specific solar phenomena would they have observed? The most obvious would be the solstices. There's the summer solstice, around June 20th or 21st in our modern calendar, the longest day of the year, when the sun reaches its highest point in the sky at midday and seems to stand still, which is what solstice means before beginning its slow descent southwards again. This marked the peak of summer, the time of greatest heat. Conversely, there was the winter solstice, around December 21st or 22nd, the shortest day of the year, when the sun is at its lowest midday point. This was the heart of winter such as it was in Sumer, more a cool, damp season than a frozen one. And crucially, it marked the point from which the days would begin to lengthen again, a promise of returning light and warmth. Observing these turning points would require careful tracking of the sun's position at sunrise or sunset along the horizon, or perhaps measuring the length of shadows cast by a gnomon, a vertical stick or pillar at midday. Equally important were the equinoxes, occurring around March 20th or 21st spring, or vernal equinox and September 22nd or 23rd, autumnal equinox. These are the 2 points in the year when day and night are of approximately equal length, when the sun crosses the celestial equator. The spring equinox signaled the true beginning of the growing season, a time of renewal and burgeoning life. The autumnal equinox marked the transition towards the cooler, darker part of the year, often coinciding with major harvest activities. These 4 points, the 2 solstices and the 2 equinoxes, effectively divided the solar year into 4 quarters, providing key anchors for understanding the progression of the seasons. Sumerians getting really excited about equal daylight and darkness day sounds like a very specific kind of party. Hooray, 12 hours of sun, 12 hours of stars. Let's celebrate by doing exactly what we did yesterday, but with more awareness of celestial balance. While direct observation of the sun's position can be tricky, don't stare at the sun. Kids, even if you're an ancient Sumerian priest, the Sumerians also had another tool for tracking the solar year, the stars. Certain prominent stars or constellations would make their first appearance in the pre-dawn sky, their heliacal rising, or their last appearance in the post-dusk sky, their heliacal setting at specific, predictable times of the year. These stellar events, being tied to the Earth's orbit around the sun, were reliable indicators of the solar year's progress. For example, the heliacal rising of the star cluster Pleiades in spring was a widely recognized marker for the beginning of the sailing and farming season in many ancient cultures. While the Egyptians famously used the heliacal rising of Sirius to predict the Nile's inundation, the Sumerians would have had their own set of key stars or constellations whose appearances and disappearances correlated with their local seasons. The flooding patterns of the Tigris and Euphrates, and the optimal times for planting and harvesting their specific crops like barley and sesame. Ancient agricultural societies, including those in Mesopotamia, meticulously observed solar events like solstices and equinoxes, and also the heliacal risings and settings of particular stars, to help them accurately determine the progression of the seasons for successful farming and the timing of related religious festivals. This growing understanding of the solar year, approximately 365 days long, brought the Sumerians face to face with the fundamental problem we discussed earlier. How do you make a year composed of lunar months, totaling about 354 days, fit neatly into this longer solar cycle? The moon and the sun seemed to be operating on 2 different, slightly incompatible time systems. It was clear that the solar year was the true master of the seasons in agriculture. The challenge now was to reconcile their beloved, familiar lunar months with this overriding solar reality. This was the dawn of the lunisolar calendar concept, an attempt to have the best of both worlds, to keep the convenient monthly divisions provided by the moon, but to ensure that these months stayed roughly in sync with the solar seasons. Okay, team. A high priest of Utu might announce to the priests of Nana, "We love your whole moon phase thing. It's very poetic, very nighttime chic, but Utu's Solar Express train is leaving the station, and your lunar local keeps falling behind. We need to find a way to get you both on the same track, or at least arriving at the major seasonal stations at roughly the same time." A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some Sumerian temples, particularly the ziggurats, are thought by certain archaeoastronomers to have possessed deliberate astronomical alignments. For example, the orientation of the corners or stairways of a ziggurat might have been aligned with the points of sunrise or sunset at the solstices or equinoxes. If true, this would indicate that these solar events were not just passively observed, but were ritually significant and architecturally incorporated into their most sacred structures, underscoring the deep connection between their understanding of cosmic order and their religious practices. The temple itself could have acted as a giant, ceremonial observatory. The exact sophistication of Sumerian solar observational techniques and their ability to precisely determine the exact dates of solstices and equinoxes in the very earliest periods late 4th to early 3rd millennium BCE, versus a more general awareness of these seasonal turning points based on broader observations of daylight length and solar position, is still being assessed based on often indirect textual and limited archaeological clues. Precise astronomical records become more common later in Mesopotamian history. With the Babylonians, however, the Sumerians laid the crucial groundwork. They recognized the sun's steady beat, they saw how it governed the seasons, and they understood that any truly useful calendar had to march, ultimately, to its rhythm. The question that remained was how to elegantly or even clumsily make their moon steps fall into line. And that, as we'll see, would involve a clever, if somewhat periodically disruptive, little trick called intercalation. We've seen the Sumerians gazing at the heavens, first captivated by the moon's cyclical dance, then realizing its charming but ultimately unreliable rhythm for the all-important agricultural seasons. They turned to the sun, the great Utu, and the steadfast stars to understand the true length of the year, the steady beat that governed harvests and floods. But this left them with a rather significant cosmic conundrum, their beloved lunar months. So convenient for everyday tracking, didn't neatly fit into the solar year. There was that pesky gap of about 11 days. The lunar year was a short changer, always finishing ahead of the sun and leaving the seasons confused and out of sync. So, what's a brilliant, early civilization to do when their two main celestial timekeepers refuse to play nicely together? Well, you invent a clever little trick, a bit of temporal tinkering, to try and force them into harmony. This is the story of intercalation, the Sumerian solution to fixing time, or at least giving it a periodic, much-needed adjustment with the extra month trick. Imagine the scene in a Sumerian temple courtyard, perhaps in Ur or Nippur. The priests and scribes, the official timekeepers and calendar managers of their day, are gathered. They've been meticulously observing the moon, counting the days, naming the months. They've also been watching the sun's path, noting the solstices and equinoxes, and tracking the heliacal risings of important stars that signal the changing seasons. And their clay tablet records, year after year, are showing that same frustrating drift. The month of the barley harvest is arriving when the barley is still decidedly green and unenthusiastic about being reaped. The great festival for the city god, meant to coincide with the spring floods, is now happening when the river is looking rather sluggish and uninspired. It's a calendrical crisis. The gods might be displeased. The farmers are definitely confused. The tax collectors are probably rubbing their hands with glee at the potential for extra collections if they can just squeeze in another month somewhere. "Esteemed colleagues," the head priest might announce, his brow furrowed like an unplowed field. It appears Nana and Utu are not seeing eye to eye again. Our months are having a party in spring while the actual spring is still trying to find its sandals. We need to do something. or the sacred sheep will be offered 3 weeks before they're ritually plump enough. The solution, the Sumerians, and indeed many other ancient cultures facing the same lunisolar puzzle, eventually landed upon was intercalation. It sounds like a complicated medical procedure, but it simply means inserting an extra or intercalary month into the calendar every now and then. The goal was to let the lunar months run their course for a couple of years, accumulating that 11-day annual shortfall, and then, when the lunar calendar had drifted too far behind the solar seasonal year, perhaps by a full month or so, an extra month would be popped into the calendar to bring it roughly back into alignment. It's like adding a strategic catch-up month. Ancient Mesopotamian calendars, including the later, more standardized Babylonian ones, which evolved from Sumerian foundations, were fundamentally lunisolar and systematically utilized intercalary months, inserted periodically according to increasingly sophisticated rules to reconcile the lunar and solar cycles and keep the calendar aligned with the agricultural seasons. How did this extra month trick work in practice in early summer initially? The decision to intercalate a month was likely not based on a fixed mathematical cycle, but on direct observation and empirical need. The temple authorities, or perhaps even the king, would observe that the existing calendar months were becoming seriously misaligned with the agricultural seasons or the traditional timing of important festivals. For example, if the month that was supposed to be for planting sesame was arriving when it was still far too cold, or if the festival of the grain goddess was due but the grain was nowhere near ready for offering, it was a clear sign that the calendar needed a corrective nudge. At this point, a decree would be issued, declaring that an extra month would be inserted. Hear ye, a royal crier might announce in the marketplace. By order of the great king Ur-Nammu, and after much consultation with the priests of Nana, who have noticed the moon as being particularly uncooperative with the barley. This year shall have 2, month of the divine plows, the first one for regular plowing, and the second one for extra plowing, or perhaps for complaining about the first one. The scribes are still working out the details. Just pay your taxes for both. Please, what was this intercalary month called? Often. It didn't get its own unique, fancy name. It was frequently designated simply as a second version of an existing month. So, you might have a second Ululu, a common month name in later Mesopotamian calendars, roughly August to September, or a Diri month, from the Sumerian word for intercalary. This extra month would effectively push all subsequent months in that year forward, helping to realign the start of the next year with the desired seasonal point. Of course, this ad hoc system of intercalation had its own set of challenges. Deciding exactly when to insert the extra month, and how often, would have been a significant responsibility, requiring careful observation and judgment. If you intercalated too soon or too often, the calendar might drift in the opposite direction. If you waited too long, the misalignment with the seasons could become severe, causing real hardship. Moreover, the sudden announcement of an extra month could cause considerable confusion and disruption in everyday life. Imagine having a loan due in what you thought was the 6th month, only to find out there's now an extra 6th month, effectively extending your repayment period, or if you were the lender, delaying your income. Religious festival schedules would need to be adjusted. Labor contracts that were set for a certain number of months might suddenly become longer. It required a degree of flexibility and centralized authority to manage these adjustments. Over time, as astronomical knowledge and record-keeping improved, the Sumerians and their successors, the Babylonians, began to develop more systematic rules for intercalation. They started to recognize longer-term patterns in the relationship between lunar and solar cycles. While they didn't arrive at the highly precise Metonic cycle, a Greek discovery of the 5th century BCE, which recognized that 19 solar years are almost exactly equal to 235 lunar months, leading to a highly accurate system of inserting 7 intercalary months over a 19-year period. The Mesopotamians were certainly moving in that direction. By the later Old Babylonian period around 1800–1600 BCE, intercalation was becoming more regular, often with specific months designated as potential candidates for duplication. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that royal correspondence and official decrees from Mesopotamia sometimes explicitly mention the need to insert an intercalary month, and the reasons for it, highlighting that this was a matter of significant state importance, and not just an obscure calculation made by priests in a back room. For example, a king might write to a provincial governor, stating something like, "The year is not in order." The current month name, should be followed by a second, same month name. You are to ensure that the tribute from your district is collected according to this revised schedule. And tell the farmers not to panic. The gods and I know what we're doing. Mostly. Such pronouncements underscore the centralized control needed to implement these calendrical adjustments across a kingdom. The exact degree of systematization in Sumerian intercalation practices during the early dynastic period, roughly 2900, 2350 BCE, versus more ad hoc observational adjustments made when the seasonal drift became too problematic, is difficult to ascertain precisely from the available textual evidence, which is often fragmentary or focused on other administrative matters. It's likely a gradual evolution from purely reactive corrections to more predictive, rule-based intercalation as their understanding of celestial mechanics deepened over centuries. This extra month trick, this system of intercalation, was the Sumerians' ingenious way of wrestling their beloved lunar calendar into a working relationship with the uncompromising solar year. It allowed them to retain the convenience and familiarity of months based on the easily observable moon, while ensuring that their agricultural activities and major religious festivals generally stayed in sync with the actual seasons. It was a pragmatic compromise, a clever fudge. But it worked well enough to serve their civilization for millennia, and to lay the foundation for many later calendar systems. It just meant that, every now and then, everyone got a surprise bonus month, which probably felt less like a holiday and more like an extra month of rent and civic duties. So, the Sumerians, with their clever extra month trick of intercalation, have managed to get their lunar months and the solar year to at least acknowledge each other at family gatherings, even if they're not best friends. They now have a system of 12, or occasionally 13, months that roughly aligns with the agricultural seasons and the grander celestial rhythms. But what did they call these months unlike our modern calendar, with its rather dry, often Roman-derived names like January for Janus or March for Mars, or simply numbered months like September, originally the 7th? If you start in March, Sumerian month names were often far more evocative, more deeply connected to the fabric of their daily lives, their agricultural cycle, and, crucially, their vibrant pantheon of gods and goddesses. Let's explore how the months got their divine or descriptive personalities, turning the calendar not just into a tool for timekeeping, but into a living testament to their culture and beliefs. Imagine a Sumerian scribe, stylus in hand, carefully pressing cuneiform wedges into a soft clay tablet. He's not just recording a transaction or a royal decree, he's noting the date. And that date includes a month name that resonates with meaning for everyone in his city-state. Sumerian and later Mesopotamian month names were often derived from significant agricultural activities that took place during that time of year. Major religious festivals celebrated then, or prominent natural phenomena characteristic of that particular season. This practice imbued the calendar with a rich layer of cultural and religious meaning, making each month feel distinct, with its own character and its own set of associated expectations and duties. It wasn't just month number 6, it was, for example, the month of the sacred plowing, a name that immediately told you what was going on and which deities might be particularly relevant. Let's consider some of the types of names they used. Agricultural activities were a very common source. You might have a month called Aitu Sigga, the month of brickmaking, when the sun was hot enough to dry bricks quickly, perhaps after the floods had receded and provided fresh clay, or Itu Apindua, the month of the opening of the furrow by the plow, clearly indicating the start of the plowing season. There could be Itu She Gur Ten Ku5, the month of cutting the barley, or Itu Kindinana, the month of the work of Inanna, possibly related to the date harvest, with which the goddess Inanna, later Ishtar, was sometimes associated. These names acted as built-in reminders, a kind of agricultural almanac woven into the very fabric of the year. When you heard the name of the month, you knew what season it was and what tasks were likely at hand. Ah, it's month of persuading the oxen to actually pull the plow straight. My favorite. The oxen are usually very opinionated this time of year. Religious festivals were another major inspiration for month names. Many Sumerian cities had their own patron deities, and the major festivals honoring these gods and goddesses would often lend their names to the months in which they occurred. For instance, in the city of Nippur, which was a major religious center, the calendar included month names like Idubara, Zag, G, Geir, month of the sanctuary throne, or Idumas, DAGU7, LA, month of the great offering of gazelles. In Lagash, you might find Atugan, Gun, the month of the festival of the god Ningersu. These names immediately signaled a period of important religious activity, a time when the community would gather for ceremonies, sacrifices, and feasts in honor of their divine protectors. It would be like us naming a month of the Great Thanksgiving Turkey Pardoning. If that were our primary religious observance, sometimes natural phenomena characteristic of a particular time of year would give a month its name. You might have a month of great heat, or a month of the rising of the waters. Though these are more general categories, more often the agricultural or festival link was stronger. It's also clear that specific deities were strongly associated with certain months, even if the month name itself wasn't directly their own. The major festival within a month would usually be dedicated to a particular god or goddess, making that deity the star of that period. For example, the New Year festival. The Akitu, though more prominent in later Babylonian times, it had Sumerian antecedents, was often linked to the chief god of the city or the national god, like Marduk in Babylon, and the month in which it fell would be intensely focused on that deity's cult. The Sumerian pantheon was vast, with gods for everything from the sky and earth to beer-making and reed weaving. So there were plenty of divine personalities to go around when it came to associating them with specific times of the year. This practice of naming months after agricultural or religious events served to reinforce the deep connection between the calendar, the rhythms of daily life, and the divine order that the Sumerians believed governed their world. Time wasn't just an abstract, neutral progression of days. Each month had its own sacred or practical flavor, its own set of responsibilities and celebrations. It helped to structure not just their work year, but their spiritual year as well. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that sometimes the same agricultural activity or a similar type of festival might give its name to different months in the calendars of different Sumerian city-states. Or the precise timing of a festival dedicated to the same god could shift slightly from one city to another. This reflected local variations in agricultural cycles due to slightly different microclimates or irrigation schedules, different local cultic traditions, or simply the independent development of calendars before a more standardized system like the Nippur calendar, which became influential later gained wider acceptance. This could lead to a bit of calendar chaos if you were trying to coordinate activities between cities, a topic we'll touch upon more later. Wait, your month of sacred beer brewing is now. Ours isn't for another 3 weeks. This completely messes up our inner-city beer festival plans. The precise etymology and original religious or agricultural significance of some of the more obscure Sumerian month names remain challenging for modern scholars to decipher completely. The cuneiform script can be ambiguous, and our understanding of some very ancient cultic practices or specific agricultural nuances is still incomplete. These enigmatic month names offer tantalizing glimpses into very old ways of thinking, into lost rituals or forgotten seasonal markers, like faint echoes from the dawn of recorded time. So, as you imagine a Sumerian family going about their lives, remember that the very name of the month hanging in the air around them, perhaps announced by a temple crier or noted by a scribe on a clay tablet, would carry a wealth of meaning. It wasn't just June or October, it was the time when the seed is placed in the earth, or the festival of the return of Dumuzid the shepherd. These names help to weave the passage of time into a rich tapestry of human endeavor and divine presence, making the calendar not just a tool but a story, a sacred narrative that unfolded year after year. Each month was a chapter, with its own divine protagonist and its own set of earthly duties and celebrations. We've explored how the Sumerians, with their keen observational skills and pressing societal needs, developed a lunisolar calendar, naming their months after agricultural events, religious festivals, or the deities who presided over them. They had a system for tracking longer periods, days, months, and the seasonally adjusted year. But what about shorter cycles within the month? Did they have anything akin to our familiar 7-day week? That steady, repeating rhythm that structures so much of our modern lives, culminating in the much anticipated weekend. This is where the Sumerian story takes a turn that might surprise our work-weary, weekend-loving sensibilities. Let's ponder how the Sumerians divided up their days and whether their calendar ever whispered of a Saturday morning for sleeping in and watching. Well, whatever the Sumerian equivalent of cartoons might have been, probably just more clay tablets about barley distribution. The lunar month, as we know, is approximately 29.5 days long, which the Sumerians managed by alternating 29 and 30-day months, or by declaring the new month with the sighting of the first crescent. Now, 29 or 30 days do not divide neatly by 7. This simple mathematical inconvenience is one of the first clues that a continuously cycling 7-day week, with named days like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, was not a feature of the earliest Sumerian calendar systems. If they didn't have a 7-day week, what kind of shorter divisions within the month did they recognize? The most natural way to divide a lunar month is by observing the moon's primary phases. You have the new moon, or the first visible crescent. Then approximately 7 days later, the first quarter when half the moon is illuminated. About 7 days after that, you reach the full moon, a period of maximum lunar brightness. Another 7 days or so brings the last quarter. And then finally, about 7 more days lead back to the disappearance of the moon before the new crescent appears again. These 4 phases, new, first quarter, full, last quarter, naturally break the 29.5-day lunar cycle into 4 periods, each approximately 7.4 days long. This is very close to our 7-day week, and it's likely that the Sumerians, being meticulous moon gazers, were keenly aware of these quarter-month markers. Did they formalize these 7.4-day periods into a named week? Not in the way we understand it, with a fixed sequence of named days that repeats regardless of the month's length. However, these lunar phases were certainly significant. The new moon and the full moon, in particular, were oftentimes for special religious observances, sacrifices, or festivals. It's plausible that these natural divisions of the lunar cycle influenced the scheduling of certain recurrent activities or market days. For instance, a community might have a market day that occurred roughly every quarter moon, or certain temple duties might have been performed on a cycle tied to these phases. While the number 7 held considerable symbolic and religious significance in Mesopotamian cultures, think of the 7 gates to the underworld, the 7 sages, or Epkalu, the 7 sometimes principal celestial bodies visible to the naked eye, sun, moon, and the 5 classical planets Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. There is no clear, unambiguous evidence from the earliest Sumerian periods for a continuously cycling 7-day week with named days that reset every 7 days and a fixed day of rest for the general populace. The idea of a week that marches on relentlessly, irrespective of where it falls within the lunar month, seems to be a later development. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some later cuneiform tablets from Babylonian times who inherited and developed Sumerian traditions list certain days of the month as evil days or unlucky days, umulemnuti. These often included the 7th, 14th, 19th, 21st, and 28th days of a lunar month. These days weren't weekends in our sense, but rather times when certain activities were prescribed or considered dangerous. For example, the king might be advised not to travel, eat certain foods, or engage in important state business on these days. The 19th day was sometimes considered particularly unlucky, being the 49th day from the beginning of the previous month, 7x7, a week of weeks. While this shows a recognition of 7-day multiples in certain numerological ideas, it's still tied to specific days within the month, rather than a free-floating, continuous 7-day cycle. And it was more about avoiding misfortune than enjoying leisure. Oh dear, it's the 19th, a Babylonian might sigh. Guess I'll just stay in my reed hut and try not to make eye contact with any wrathful deities. So much for finishing that irrigation ditch. So, if they didn't have a 7-day week with a designated day off, what structured their shorter-term rhythms? It was likely a combination of The natural rhythm of daylight and darkness. The day was for work mostly, the night for rest mostly, the demands of specific tasks. Agricultural work was intense during planting and harvest, perhaps less so at other times. Craftspeople might work more regular hours. Religious festival days. These were the primary breaks from normal routine, but they were dictated by the monthly lunar calendar and seasonal solar events, not by a weekly cycle. Market days. Some scholars speculate that markets might have been held at regular intervals, perhaps every 5, 6, 8, or 10 days, creating a commercial cycle for local communities. This would provide a rhythm for traders and those bringing produce to sell. Administrative or temple work cycles. Temple estates or royal administrations might have had their own internal work schedules or duty rosters that operated on cycles other than 7 days. The extent to which Sumerians observed or recognized shorter, regular cycles within the month beyond the major lunar phases, new, quarter, full quarter, and whether these constituted a form of proto-week that influenced later systems is a subject of ongoing scholarly investigation and depends heavily on the interpretation of limited and sometimes ambiguous textual evidence. It's a fascinating puzzle. They were clearly capable of sophisticated mathematical and astronomical observation. So why didn't a simple, repeating 7-day week emerge more clearly? Perhaps the dominance of the lunar month, with its slightly awkward length, made such a rigid subdivision less natural or less necessary for them. Or perhaps their social and economic structures simply didn't require it in the same way that later, more complex societies did. Their hump day might have just been slightly more waxing than yesterday moon day, and, oh look, more barley. The concept of a week, especially one that culminates in a day or two of dedicated rest and leisure for the entire population, seems to be an idea that took much longer to develop and has different historical roots, including the Jewish Sabbath tradition and later, Roman and Christian influences. For the Sumerians, their time was marked by the moon, the sun, the seasons, and the demands of their gods and their fields. A day off just because it was the 7th day in a row, that particular celestial gear simply hadn't clicked into place in their intricate, ancient clockwork. We've established that the ancient Sumerians, for all their calendrical ingenuity in tracking months and years, didn't quite have the equivalent of our modern 7-day week, and certainly not a regularly scheduled weekend for kicking back with a clay tablet full of epic poetry and a cool barley beer, though the barley beer was definitely a thing. So if they weren't enjoying a Saturday cuneiform cartoon marathon or a Sunday ziggurat brunch special, what kind of breaks or special days did punctuate their lives? The answer lies not in a weekly cycle of leisure, but in a more irregular, yet culturally vital, pattern of sacred pauses, holy days, festival days, and even certain unlucky days when normal work might be curtailed or specific behaviors prescribed. These were not holidays in our modern sense of personal vacation time, but rather communally observed occasions, deeply embedded in their religious beliefs and their relationship with the gods and the cosmos. The Sumerian year, as structured by their lunisolar calendar, was peppered with religious festivals. These were numerous and varied, dedicated to the great gods and goddesses of their pantheon. In sky, Enlil air, Enki water and wisdom, Inanna love, fertility, and war. Nana the moon, Utu the sun, and many others, including the patron deities of individual city-states. Sumerian and Mesopotamian societies observed numerous religious festivals and holy days throughout the year, which involved specific rituals, offerings, and often communal participation, sometimes involving a temporary cessation of normal labor for certain segments of the population, particularly those directly involved in temple service or specific crafts related to the festival. What happened on these festival days? They were times of intense communal and religious activity. There would be public ceremonies and processions, with statues of the gods perhaps being carried from their temples through the city streets, or on sacred barges along the canals, for all to see and venerate. Imagine the sights and sounds: priests in elaborate attire, chanting hymns and prayers, musicians playing harps, lyres, drums, and pipes, offerings of food, drink, incense, and precious goods being presented at the temples. Sacrifices, usually of animals like sheep, goats, or cattle, would be a central part of many festivals. The blood and smoke seen as conveying messages and sustenance to the divine realm, with the cooked meat often being shared in a communal feast afterwards. These feasts were a crucial element, a time for the community to share in the god's bounty, to reinforce social bonds, and to enjoy a welcome abundance of food and drink, a break from the everyday fare. It's like your entire city having a massive, divinely sanctioned potluck, where everyone hopes the god of brewing brought his A game. For the duration of a major festival, which could last for several days, normal work activities might indeed be suspended, at least for a significant portion of the population. Farmers might leave their fields, craftspeople might close their workshops, and merchants might halt their trade to participate in the communal rites and celebrations. This wasn't time off for personal leisure, however, it was time dedicated to religious duty, to ensuring the continued favor of the gods, which was seen as essential for the prosperity and survival of the city-state. Your attendance at the grand procession of the sacred goat of Lagash was probably mandatory, or at least highly encouraged, with divine side-eye from the priests for anyone caught trying to sneak off to do some extra plowing. Beyond the grand citywide festivals, there were also simpler, more regular observances tied to the lunar cycle, such as new moon festivals, Esheshu or Ubu, and full moon celebrations. These marked significant points in the month and likely involved specific household or temple rituals, offerings, and perhaps a temporary alteration of daily routines. Then there were the unlucky days, Umulemnuti, or prescribed days, which we touched upon briefly. These were specific days within the lunar month often, in later Babylonian traditions which drew from Sumerian roots. Days like the 7th, 14th, 19th, 21st, and 28th that were considered inauspicious for certain actions, or sometimes generally unlucky. On these days, it wasn't about rest and relaxation, it was about caution and avoidance. The king, whose well-being was intimately tied to the well-being of the state, might have to observe a particularly strict set of prohibitions, perhaps refraining from eating certain foods, wearing certain garments, traveling, making important decisions, or even speaking aloud. Other individuals, depending on their status or profession, might also avoid specific tasks. This wasn't a day off to recharge your batteries. It was more like a day of lying low to avoid divine static cling. Mikey, what? You wouldn't plan your wedding or launch a new business venture on the day when Enlil stubbed his toe and cursed all left-handed potters. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some cuneiform divination texts, particularly omen series like Enuma Anu Enlil, which deals with celestial omens, or Shuma Alu terrestrial omens, would provide extensive lists of what various signs portended, and by extension, what activities were favorable or unfavorable on particular days or under specific circumstances. This created a complex overlay of do's and don'ts that could significantly influence daily routines and decision-making, especially for important individuals or state affairs. It was like having a very detailed, very superstitious daily horoscope that everyone actually took seriously. The liver of this morning's sheep has an extra lobe, and a spider spun a web on the temple gate facing west. Clearly, no one should eat figs or attempt to negotiate trade deals with Elam today. Best just stay in and regrout the ziggurat. It's important to emphasize that the Sumerian concept of rest, or a break from work, was fundamentally different from our modern idea of a weekend. For them, cessation of normal labor was almost always tied to religious obligation or the avoidance of ill fortune. It wasn't primarily about individual leisure, personal recuperation from a 5-day work week, or family vacation time. It was about maintaining the correct relationship with the divine and cosmic order. The degree to which these various festival days, or so-called unlucky days in Sumer, resulted in a widespread and complete cessation of all labor for the general agricultural population, as opposed to primarily affecting temple personnel, royal activities, specific crafts, or simply dictating that different kinds of perhaps ritualistic work be done, is difficult to determine with absolute precision from the available sources. Life, especially agricultural life, has its own pressing demands that don't always neatly pause for every minor deity's special day. The cows still needed milking, even if it was the day of appeasing the slightly annoyed god of mud bricks. So, while the Sumerians didn't have weekends, Their year was certainly not an unbroken expanse of toil. It was punctuated by these sacred pauses, these moments of communal religious focus, feasting, and sometimes anxious inactivity. These days provided structure, meaning, and a shared rhythm to their lives, a different kind of time off that was less about personal freedom and more about collective responsibility to the gods and the community. Their holiday calendar was more about propitiation than poolside relaxation. We've explored the sacred pauses in Sumerian life, the festivals, the holy days, the moments when the usual routines might shift for religious or ritualistic reasons. But what about the days in between? What was the daily grind actually like for the average Sumerian if they didn't have the regular punctuation of a weekend to look forward to? No, thank Utu, it's Friday feeling. Understanding the typical labor and rhythm of their daily existence helps us appreciate why the concept of a structured, universal weekend simply didn't feature in their worldview. Life for most was a continuous cycle of work dictated by the seasons, the needs of the land, the demands of the temple or palace, and the position of the sun in the sky. For the vast majority of the Sumerian population, life was inextricably linked to agricultural labor. The vast majority of the Sumerian population was engaged in agricultural labor, which was highly seasonal and dictated by the rhythms of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and the needs of crops like barley, their main staple, wheat, sesame, dates, and various vegetables. Their workday would have begun early, likely with the first light of dawn, to make the most of the cooler morning hours before the Mesopotamian sun climbed high and beat down with its full intensity. Imagine a Sumerian farmer, his family perhaps working alongside him, heading out to the fields that stretched beyond the city walls. Fields often irrigated by a network of canals that required constant maintenance. The tasks would vary immensely with the season. There was the back-breaking work of plowing, using simple wooden ard plows, often pulled by oxen if the farmer was fortunate enough to own or have access to them, or sometimes by human effort. Then came sowing the seeds, a task that required care and hope. Irrigation was a constant concern, opening and closing sluice gates, clearing canals of silt and weeds to ensure the precious water reached the thirsty crops. Weeding was an endless battle against unwanted plants competing for water and nutrients. And then, the period of most intense labor, the harvest. Cutting the ripe barley or wheat with clay or later bronze sickles, bundling the sheaves, threshing the grain to separate it from the chaff perhaps by having animals tread on it, or by beating it with flails and then winnowing it in the wind. This was an all-hands-on-deck operation, vital for the survival of the family and the community. Work during these peak agricultural seasons would undoubtedly be from sunup to sundown, with only brief pauses for a meager meal or a drink of water. There was no quitting time when the harvest was ripe and needed to be brought in before it spoiled or was lost to pests or sudden storms. What about those not directly tilling the soil? Craftspeople and artisans, potters shaping clay on early potters' wheels, weavers tending their looms, metalworkers forging bronze tools or weapons, stonemasons carving statues or dressing bricks for monumental constructions would also have had long workdays. Many were likely attached to temple or palace workshops, which were major centers of production and employment. Their hours might have been somewhat more regular than agricultural labor, but still likely governed by daylight. The quality of their work was crucial, whether it was a simple pot for everyday use or an ornate piece for a royal tomb. Just another 17,000 identical clay bowls to throw today. A Sumerian potter might sigh to his apprentice. The temple needs them for the festival of slightly too many bowls. Yamas, try not to let your mind wander, or they'll all end up looking like surprised fish again. Then there were the scribes, the literate elite of Sumerian society. Their work was mental rather than physical, but no less demanding. They would spend long hours hunched over damp clay tablets, meticulously pressing wedge-shaped signs into the clay with a reed stylus. They were the record keepers, the accountants, the administrators, the librarians, the scholars, and the transmitters of religious and literary traditions. Learning cuneiform, with its hundreds of complex signs, was an arduous process that took many years. Once qualified, a scribe might work for the temple, the palace, or perhaps a wealthy merchant, recording transactions, drafting letters, copying hymns or epic poems, or calculating land yields and tax obligations. Eye strain, cramped fingers, and the pressure of accuracy must have been constant occupational hazards. No spell check on a clay tablet. Unfortunately, a mistake could mean a very angry god or a very unhappy tax inspector. Temple personnel formed another significant segment of the workforce. Beyond the high priests and priestesses, temples employed a vast array of people administrators, overseers of agricultural lands and workshops. Brewer's beer was a staple and also a religious offering. Baker's bread likewise, musicians, singers, ritual attendants, and maintenance staff. The temple was a complex economic and social institution, a city within a city, and keeping it running smoothly required constant organized labor. The gods, after all, had daily needs, offerings to be prepared, hymns to be sung, courtyards to be swept. They were demanding employers. For some, work might come in the form of corvée labor. This was a system where citizens were required to provide unpaid labor service to the state, the temple or the palace for a certain period each year. This was how massive public works projects like the construction of ziggurats, city walls, or major irrigation canals were often accomplished. It wasn't voluntary and it wasn't a paid holiday. It was a civic duty, a way for the rulers to mobilize the collective manpower of the community for large-scale undertakings. Being called up for your corvée duty to haul mud bricks for the new city wall in the middle of summer was probably not something anyone looked forward to. So, what about leisure in this dawn-to-dusk world of work and duty? It would have been very different from our structured weekends or evenings off. Moments of rest and social interaction would have been snatched during the hottest part of the day, when work in the fields might pause. Evenings, after the main work was done and the evening meal consumed, would be a time for family, for storytelling as we've discussed, for simple games, or perhaps for music if someone in the household could play an instrument. The major festivals were the primary form of communal break, but as we saw, these were more about religious participation and feasting than individual unstructured leisure. A Sumerian wisdom literature text or collection of proverbs sometimes offers advice on the importance of diligence in one's work, or warnings against idleness or sloth, suggesting that a strong work ethic was a valued societal norm. For example, one proverb might say something like, "The farmer who neglects his field will find only thorns at harvest," or "The restless ox driver causes his wagon to creak and his journey to be slow." These are paraphrased, but capture the spirit. The lines between work time, family time, and religious time were far more blurred and integrated than in our modern, highly segmented lives. Work was not just a means to an economic end. It was often tied to family obligations, community survival, and service to the gods. Estimating the average number of truly work-free days per year for a typical Sumerian agricultural worker, considering all the festival days, any prescribed unlucky days, and seasonal lulls in agricultural activity, is highly speculative and would have varied significantly based on their specific location. City-state customs differed, their social status, the demands of their particular occupation, and the period within Sumerian history, but it's safe to say that the concept of a regular 2-day break every 5 days for purely personal rest and recreation simply wasn't part of their temporal landscape. Their time off was a sacred pause, not a secular holiday, and their alarm clock was the sun, or perhaps a very insistent rooster with a good sense of civic duty. We've seen the ancient Sumerians wrestling with the rhythms of the moon and sun, developing a lunisolar calendar with named months tied to their agricultural and religious lives, and even pondering shorter cycles within the month, though not quite arriving at our modern weekend. But who was in charge of all this temporal organization? Who decided when an extra month was needed? Who announced the start of festivals or proclaimed those occasionally unlucky days in Sumerian society? This crucial role of official timekeeper, the manager of sacred and civic cycles, fell largely to the priests and the powerful temple institutions they served. The gods, it seemed, not only existed in time but also dictated its very schedule, and their earthly representatives were the ones holding the divine appointment book. Imagine the great temple complexes that dominated the heart of every Sumerian city-state. The towering ziggurat of Nana the moon god in Ur, the sacred precinct of Enlil, god of air and storms, in Nippur, or the temple of Inanna, goddess of love and war, in Uruk. These weren't just simple places of worship. They were vast economic, administrative, and social centers. Sumerian temples were powerful institutions that owned large tracts of agricultural land, herds of livestock, and extensive workshops. They employed a multitude of people, from high priests and priestesses down to farmers, brewers, weavers, and scribes. And they played a key role in the overall administration and economic organization of their respective city-states, which naturally included the regulation and maintenance of the calendar and the schedule of religious festivals. The temple was, in many ways, the central nervous system of the Sumerian city, and timekeeping was one of its vital functions. Is it the festival of Gula, the healing goddess, yet? A citizen might ask. Better check the temple bulletin board, or rather, the freshly inscribed clay tablet posted by the main gate. Hope Gula isn't feeling too intercalary this year. The priests, and sometimes priestesses, who held significant roles in many cults were therefore the primary specialists in calendrical matters. They were the ones with the training, the resources, and the sacred duty to observe the celestial bodies. From the top of the ziggurat, which offered a clear view of the horizon, unobstructed by the low-lying city buildings, or from specially designated observation points, they would meticulously track the phases of the moon, the journey of the sun through its solstices and equinoxes, and the heliacal risings and settings of important stars or constellations. This wasn't just idle stargazing, it was a crucial part of their job description. Their observations determined when a new lunar month began, when the agricultural seasons were shifting, and, critically, when the all-important intercalation of an extra month was needed to keep the calendar from drifting too far out of sync with the solar year. The temple's pronouncements on these matters would have carried divine authority. If the priests of Nana said it was the start of a new month, then it was, regardless of whether your own personal moon-watching efforts agreed entirely. They had the official celestial hotline, so to speak. The temple's deep involvement in the economy made accurate timekeeping absolutely essential. Temples directly managed vast agricultural estates. They needed to know when to schedule plowing, sowing, irrigation, and harvesting on their own lands to maximize yields and ensure a steady supply of produce for temple offerings, for rationing to temple dependents, and perhaps for trade or surplus storage. They collected tithes and offerings from the wider populace, often in the form of agricultural goods, and these would be due at specific times of the year, dictated by the temple calendar. They managed large herds of livestock, cattle, sheep, goats, and the timing of breeding, birthing, and shearing would also be influenced by seasonal and calendrical considerations. Furthermore, the temple often distributed rations of barley, oil, and wool to its numerous workers and dependents. And these distributions would occur at regular intervals, requiring a consistent timekeeping system for fair and orderly administration. You couldn't just hand out barley whenever the mood struck. There was a schedule to keep, a divine payroll to manage. The accounts for the temple sheep shearing are a mess this year. Urlama, you told me it was the month of fleecing the flock, but it turns out it was actually the month of surprising a naked, angry sheep. The omens are not good. The most visible manifestation of the temple's control over time was the ritual calendar. This was a detailed schedule of all the festivals, sacrifices, processions, and other ceremonies that needed to be performed throughout the year to honor the gods and ensure the well-being of the city. Each deity had their own special days, their own preferred offerings, their own sacred rhythms. The temple priests were responsible for maintaining this complex ritual schedule, for ensuring that all the divine appointments were kept, that the correct hymns were sung, the correct incantations recited, and the correct number of plump sheep or jars of fine beer were presented at precisely the right moment. The ziggurat itself, that iconic stepped platform reaching towards the heavens, might have served not just as a temple but also as a kind of symbolic observatory, a physical representation of the cosmic order and the structured time that the priests helped to maintain. Its very orientation might have aligned with key celestial events, as we've discussed. This control over the calendar naturally conferred immense power and authority upon the priesthood. They were the interpreters of celestial signs, the intermediaries between the human and divine realms, and the arbiters of sacred time. Their knowledge of astronomy and calendrics, often shrouded in religious mystique, set them apart and reinforced their indispensable role in society. If the priest declared an intercalary month or announced an unexpected festival due to a particular omen, the populace would generally comply, because the alternative, risking divine displeasure by ignoring the sacred schedule, was unthinkable. They were, in a very real sense, the divine Time Lords of Sumer. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some Sumerian cylinder seals, small, intricately carved stone cylinders used to roll an impression onto wet clay, depict scenes that scholars interpret as priests or priest-like figures engaged in what appear to be astronomical observations or calendrical rituals. They might be shown looking through sighting tubes, standing before altars inscribed with celestial symbols, or making offerings under specific constellations. While interpretation is always cautious, these tiny, ancient artworks offer tantalizing visual clues to the sacred and scholarly nature of early Mesopotamian timekeeping. The exact level of astronomical knowledge and predictive capability possessed by the earliest Sumerian priests, particularly regarding more complex phenomena like eclipses or the detailed movements of planets, as opposed to their more empirical observation of lunar and solar cycles for basic calendrical adjustments, is a topic of ongoing scholarly discussion and research. Highly sophisticated mathematical astronomy and eclipse prediction became much more developed later. With the Babylonians, however, the Sumerian priests were undoubtedly the pioneers, the first to systematically wrestle with the complexities of celestial time, and to translate those observations into a functional calendar that could order the lives of their communities and the worship of their gods. Their schedules were, quite literally, divinely ordained. And you can be sure that if a god sent an angry memo via a bad omen about a festival being a day late, the temple's calendrical accuracy department would be working overtime to appease them, probably with extra offerings and a very sincere apology note inscribed on the finest clay. The priests in their temples were the guardians of Sumerian time, meticulously observing the heavens and managing the sacred calendar. But their work, and indeed the entire administration of the burgeoning city-states, relied on another groundbreaking Sumerian invention: writing. The development of cuneiform script. Those distinctive wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay tablets was absolutely essential for creating sophisticated calendrical systems, for recording observations, for calculating durations, and for transmitting this vital temporal knowledge across generations and between administrative centers. Let's gently dust off some of these ancient clay tablets, metaphorically speaking, and see how the scribes of Sumer wrestled with the mathematics of time and laid the groundwork for how we still measure our hours and minutes today. The journey to becoming a scribe in ancient Sumer was not an easy one. It involved years of rigorous training in a special school called the Aduba, or Tablet House. Here, young students, mostly boys from wealthier families, though some girls also received scribal education, would learn the hundreds of complex cuneiform signs, master the Sumerian and later Akkadian languages, and be drilled in mathematics, accounting, literature, and, importantly for our story, the basics of astronomy and calendrical calculations. The Aduba was a demanding environment, with strict discipline and long hours of copying texts and practicing calculations, but the rewards were significant. Scribes formed an educated elite, essential for the functioning of the temple, the palace, and commerce. They were the ancient world's IT department, database managers, and legal team, all rolled into one, and their primary tool was the clay tablet and the reed stylus. "My son is training to be a scribe," a proud Sumerian father might boast. "He can already calculate the barley rations for 100 temple workers for 3 intercalary months, and he only makes a few catastrophic errors per tablet." What kinds of cuneiform tablets give us clues about Sumerian timekeeping? There are several types. Firstly, there are vast numbers of administrative and economic texts. These are the day-to-day records of Sumerian life receipts for goods, lists of workers and their rations, loan agreements, land sale contracts, inventories of temple herds or palace granaries, and almost all of these documents would be dated, usually with the year often named after a significant event or a ruling king's regnal year. The month name, and sometimes even the day of the month. These mundane records, by their very nature, demonstrate the practical application and importance of a functioning calendar. Then there are texts that are more explicitly calendrical. These might include lists of the standard month names for a particular city, like the influential Nipper calendar, schedules of religious festivals throughout the year, or perhaps even notes from temple officials regarding the observation of new moons or the decision to intercalate an extra month. These are like the raw data and the official schedules that underpinned their time system. Later in Mesopotamian history, building on Sumerian foundations, we find more detailed astronomical diaries and omen texts. These tablets meticulously record observations of celestial phenomena, the movements of the moon and planets, the occurrence of eclipses which were seen as potent omens, the heliacal risings of stars. While the earliest Sumerians might not have kept such detailed, systematic astronomical records, their later inheritors certainly did, and this practice undoubtedly had its roots in the earlier Sumerian need to observe the heavens for calendrical purposes. Perhaps most significantly for our modern understanding of time, the Sumerians developed and used a sexagesimal, or base 60 numbering system. The Sumerians developed this sexagesimal system, which was subsequently adopted and further refined by the Babylonians for sophisticated mathematical and astronomical calculations. And it is the ultimate origin of our modern division of time into 60 minutes in an hour and 60 seconds in a minute, as well as the 360 degrees in a circle. Why base 60? That's a fascinating question in itself. The precise cognitive or practical reasons why the Sumerians initially adopted or developed a base 60 system, given its apparent complexity compared to a more straightforward base 10 system, which they also used for some everyday counting, remain a fascinating area of inquiry in the history of mathematics. Theories abound. Perhaps it was the result of merging two earlier counting systems, one base 10, one base 6. Perhaps it was chosen for its high number of divisors. 60 is divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, and 60, which makes calculations involving fractions much easier. Whatever its origin, this base 60 system proved incredibly useful for astronomical calculations, for dividing circles, and for subdividing units of time. While the Sumerians didn't necessarily divide their daylight period into fixed-length hours like ours, their hours, or watches of the day and night, likely varied in length depending on the season. Their use of base 60 for mathematical and astronomical divisions laid the essential groundwork. They were thinking in terms of 60ths and multiples of 60. This mathematical framework was crucial for scribes trying to make sense of celestial cycles, to perhaps crudely predict the timing of new moons, or to calculate the accumulated drift of the lunar year against the solar year, which would inform decisions about intercalation. Imagine a Sumerian scribe, his clay tablet resting on his lap or a small table, his reed stylus poised. He's not just writing words, he's performing calculations, perhaps working out the area of a field to assess its barley yield, or the amount of silver needed to pay for a shipment of cedar wood from Lebanon. And in doing so, he's using this sophisticated base 60 system. The same system would be applied to tracking the movements of Nana the moon god or Utu the sun god across the sky. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some Mesopotamian mathematical tablets include complex problems that appear to be abstract exercises for scribes learning to manipulate numbers in the sexagesimal system, dealing with things like compound interest over long periods, or geometric calculations for irregularly shaped areas, skills that were highly valuable for temple and state administrators who managed time-bound resources and large-scale landholdings. These weren't just for fun. They were training for the serious business of running a complex society. All right, class, the Aduba teacher might say. Today's problem: if a sacred cow produces 3 jars of milk per new moon, and the temple requires 60 jars for the festival of bovine beatitude, which is in 4 moons plus 1 intercalary moon. How many extra cows do we need to borrow from the neighboring city-state without them noticing? Show your work, and no smudging the clay. The meticulous labor of these scribes, patiently pressing wedges into clay, day after day, created an invaluable archive of data. Their records, spanning centuries, allowed later generations to observe long-term patterns, to refine their understanding of celestial mechanics, and to develop increasingly accurate calendars. It was this tradition of careful record-keeping, born in Sumer, that formed the bedrock upon which much of later Babylonian, Greek, and eventually world astronomy and timekeeping was built. They weren't just counting days, they were, quite literally, writing the first drafts of our relationship with cosmic time. And if a scribe occasionally messed up a calculation and accidentally scheduled two major religious festivals on the exact same day, causing a logistical nightmare for the priests and a severe shortage of sacrificial goats. Well, that was just another interesting challenge in the ongoing human endeavor to make time behave. We've seen the Sumerian priests and scribes diligently working to observe the heavens, calculate the months, and implement the extra month trick of intercalation to keep their lunisolar calendar roughly in sync with the seasons. They had named months reflecting their agricultural and religious life, and a system that, for all its occasional clunkiness, provided a necessary framework for their society. However, it's important to remember that ancient Sumer, for much of its early history, wasn't a single unified nation under one centrally controlled calendar. Instead, it was a collection of often independent, sometimes rivalrous city-states: Uruk, Lagash, Eridu, Nippur, Kish, Umma, and others, each with its own patron deity, its own powerful temple institution, and consequently, often its own local variations in how they marked time. This could, and probably often did, lead to a delightful for us. Looking back, but likely frustrating for them, trying to do business level of calendar chaos. Imagine trying to schedule an intercity chariot race when everyone's operating on slightly different timelines. Is the Great Sumerian Chariot Derby next month according to Ur's calendar, or Uruk's slightly faster-running moon cycle calendar? And do their intercalary months have the same number of potholes? What kinds of differences might you find between the calendars of these various city-states? One of the most common variations was in the month names themselves. While the concept of a lunar month was universal, the specific names given to these months could differ significantly from one city to another. Each city might have its own traditional set of month names, often reflecting local agricultural specialties, unique local festivals, or the particular attributes of its chief patron god or goddess. So, the month of the sacred reed harvest for Enki in Eridu. Enki's cult center might be contemporaneous with the month of Inanna's joyful procession in Uruk, where Inanna was paramount. This is perfectly understandable. Local identity and religious focus would naturally shape how different communities named their temporal divisions. It only became a problem if you were, say, a merchant from Ur trying to arrange a delivery of wool to a weaver in Lagash by the third day of the month of the Gudea's glorious canal digging. A month name that might mean absolutely nothing to your Ur-based counterpart. Another key point of divergence could be the start of the year. While many Mesopotamian calendars eventually gravitated towards a spring start for the year, often around the vernal equinox, a logical time, with the renewal of agricultural life. This wasn't universally fixed from the outset. Some city-states might have begun their year in the autumn, perhaps tied to the final harvest or the start of the plowing season after the summer heat. This difference in when New Year's Day, or rather, New Year's month occurred would obviously throw off any attempt to align dates directly between two cities, using different starting points. Happy New Year! A merchant from Nippur might say to his colleague from Eridu in what the Eridu man considered the middle of his 7th month. Awkward? Perhaps the most significant source of calendar mix-ups, however, was the practice of intercalation. As we learned, the decision to insert an extra month to realign the lunar calendar with the solar year was crucial. But in the early periods, before more standardized rules emerged, this decision was often made independently by the authorities' king or temple in each city-state, based on their own local observations of seasonal drift or pressing agricultural needs. This means that in any given year, City A might decide to intercalate a month, while City B, just down the river, might not. Or they might both intercalate, but choose to insert the extra month at different points in their respective year. Or call their intercalary month by a different name, a Gaijai, second month of the divine plow, versus the extra month where we all complain about taxes. This would result in their calendars being out of step by an entire month, or even more if these discrepancies accumulated over several years. Imagine the confusion this could cause for inner-city trade, diplomacy, or legal matters. If a contract stipulated payment by a certain month, whose month was it? If a diplomatic envoy was expected to arrive for a festival in another city, they'd better be sure they were working off the correct local calendar. Or they might show up to find the party was last month, or isn't for another few weeks. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some surviving legal documents or administrative letters from Mesopotamia that involve transactions or communications between different cities occasionally have to specify which city's calendar or particular month naming system is being used for dating purposes. Or they might even give dual dates. This is a clear indication of the practical challenges posed by these local calendrical variations. It's the ancient equivalent of trying to schedule a Zoom meeting across multiple time zones, but where each time zone also has a different number of months in its year and calls them by different names. The potential for missed appointments and miscalculated delivery dates was immense. I swear, King of Kish, the tribute of lapis lazuli was sent in the month of lapis lazuli delivery. It's not my fault your month of lapis lazuli delivery is what we in Umma call the month of utter bewilderment about Kishite calendars. Over time, there was a gradual movement towards greater standardization, particularly as certain cities rose to prominence and their cultural or political influence spread. The calendar used in the important religious city of Nippur, which was the seat of the cult of Enlil, the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon for a long period, became particularly influential. Many other city-states began to adopt or adapt the Nippur month names and its system of intercalation. Later, with the rise of larger and more unified empires like the Akkadian Empire under Sargon or the Third Dynasty of Ur, and eventually the Babylonian Empire, there would have been even stronger incentives and mechanisms for imposing a more standardized calendar across wider regions to facilitate administration, tax collection, and imperial cohesion. The precise mechanisms and political or religious factors that led to the eventual widespread adoption of the Nippur calendar as a de facto standard across much of southern Mesopotamia during the later Sumerian and Old Babylonian periods are still being explored by historians, likely involving a combination of religious prestige, political power, and practical convenience. But in the earlier periods of Sumerian history, this calendar chaos was a very real feature of their temporal landscape. It reflects the decentralized political nature of early Sumer, a collection of proud and often fiercely independent city-states, each with its own traditions. While they shared a common culture, language Sumerian, and pantheon of gods, their day-to-day experience of time, at least as marked by their official calendars, could be surprisingly diverse. It's a boring but fascinating glimpse into the practical realities of ancient administration. Even something as seemingly straightforward as what month is it? There could be a surprisingly complicated question in ancient Sumer if you happen to travel from one city to the next. It makes you appreciate the sheer, unadulterated simplicity of our globally mostly synchronized Gregorian calendar, doesn't it? Or at least it makes you appreciate that when your phone says it's May, it's probably May for your cousin in the next town over, too. Usually, we've journeyed deep into the heart of Sumerian timekeeping, marveling at their ingenuity in tracking the moon and sun, their cleverness in devising the extra month trick to keep seasons roughly on schedule, and their rich tapestry of divinely named months. We've seen their priests and scribes meticulously observing the heavens and recording events on clay tablets. And we've even glimpsed the calendar chaos that could arise from different city-states marching to slightly different temporal drummers. But through all this exploration of how they structured their years, months, and even specific holy or unlucky days, one very familiar modern concept remains conspicuously absent: the weekend. That glorious 2-day, or sometimes even 3-day, if you're lucky, stretch of regular, institutionally sanctioned rest and leisure that many of us take for granted. Why is it that for all their brilliance in inventing the calendar, the Sumerians never quite seem to figure out the weekend? This is where we hit the crux of our sleepy historical investigation, the no days off really reality of ancient Sumer. Let's recap what we know about Sumerian breaks from the daily grind. They had holy days and festival days, often numerous, tied to their religious calendar. These were important communal events involving rituals, sacrifices, feasting, and sometimes a cessation of normal work, particularly for those involved in temple activities or specific crafts. But these were religious obligations, not personal leisure time. Your attendance was often expected, if not required, to appease the gods and ensure communal well-being. They also had unlucky days, umulemnudi, certain days of the month when specific activities were prescribed due to fear of ill fortune or divine displeasure. Again, this was about avoidance and caution, not relaxation and fun. It's hard to enjoy a day off if you're convinced that sharpening your bronze sickle will cause your prize-winning zebu to spontaneously combust. The fundamental issue is that the Sumerian lunar month, whether 29 or 30 days long, does not divide neatly by 7. Our modern 7-day week, with its roots in later Near Eastern traditions including the Jewish Sabbath, which emphasized a seventh day of rest ordained by God and its eventual global spread, is a continuously cycling entity, independent of the length of the month. The Sumerians did recognize divisions of the month based on the moon's 4 primary phases: new, first quarter, full, last quarter, which created periods of roughly 7.4 days. While this is close to 7, it's not a fixed, repeating 7-day pattern that would reliably produce a weekend on the same day of that cycle each time. Their weeks, if we can even call them that, were tied to the moon's appearance, not to an abstract, unending count of 7. Furthermore, the very social and economic structure of Sumerian society was not conducive to the concept of a universal weekend. The vast majority of the population were agricultural laborers, their lives dictated by the relentless, seasonal demands of farming in a challenging riverine environment. When it was time to plow, sow, irrigate, or harvest, the work needed to be done, often from sunup to sundown, regardless of what day of any hypothetical cycle it might be. The crops wouldn't wait for your 2-day break. Survival was often more precarious, and continuous effort was the norm, especially during peak agricultural seasons. There wasn't a large middle class with the economic security or structured employment that might lead to demands for regular, paid leisure time. The concept of a regular 2-day weekend as a period of rest and leisure for the general working population is a relatively modern invention, largely developing in the Western world during the 19th and 20th centuries as a result of industrialization. Labor movements advocating for workers' rights and changing social norms regarding work-life balance. Attributing such a concept back to ancient Sumer would be deeply anachronistic. Their understanding of leisure was also likely very different from ours. For a Sumerian farmer, leisure might simply be the brief respite during the hottest part of the day, a moment to sit in the shade of a date palm, or the evening hours after a long day's toil, spent with family, sharing stories, or perhaps listening to simple music. It wasn't about getting away from it all for a designated period. It was about finding small pockets of rest and social connection within the ongoing stream of work and domestic life. The big communal breaks were the religious festivals, which, as we've seen, were more about collective participation in sacred duties than individual R&R. My idea of a wild weekend, a Sumerian might say, successfully irrigating all 3 of my barley fields without a canal breach, followed by a hearty bowl of porridge and a song about Gilgamesh punching a lion. Good times. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that even the later Babylonian concept of Shapatu or Shabbatu, which occurred on the 15th day of the month, the full moon, and which some scholars have tentatively linked to the origins of the Jewish Sabbath due to the similarity in name, was not a day of joyful rest for everyone. It was often described in texts as a day for the king to pacify his heart, and for both the king and certain professions like physicians or diviners to observe restrictions on their activities. It was sometimes considered a day when the gods were particularly angry or dangerous, so it was more about appeasement and lying low than about having a relaxing day off. Not exactly the TGIF vibe. Whether the Sumerian and later Mesopotamian socio-economic system, with its heavy reliance on agricultural surplus controlled by temple and palace institutions, and its general lack of labor-saving technology beyond simple tools, could have even supported the concept of a regular, widespread weekend of cessation from essential agricultural and state labor, is a pertinent and debatable question for economic historians of the ancient Near East. For society to function, the fundamental work of producing food and maintaining infrastructure had to continue with a regularity that probably didn't allow for frequent, universal downtime. So, it's not that the Sumerians were stupid or couldn't figure out the weekend. It's simply that their societal structure, their economic realities, their religious worldview, and their very understanding of time were different from ours. The weekend, as a regular secular institution of rest and leisure for the broad population, is a product of a very different set of historical and cultural developments. The Sumerians were pioneers in organizing time on a grand scale, in creating calendars that ordered their agricultural and religious lives for millennia. But the idea of a designated time out every 7 days, just to recharge the batteries and maybe do a bit of light gardening for fun, that particular cuneiform tablet, it seems, was never written. Their "thank gods it's Friday" was more likely "thank gods the floods receded and didn't wash away all the barley seed this year." A slightly different, but no less heartfelt sentiment. Our sleepy journey through the dusty plains of ancient Sumer, exploring their ingenious methods of timekeeping and their rather demanding work schedules, is now drawing to its close. We've seen them gaze at the moon and sun, wrestle with the complexities of lunar and solar cycles, invent the extra month trick of intercalation, and structure their year around agricultural and religious festivals rather than anything resembling our modern weekend. It might seem, given their lack of Saturdays off for chariot maintenance or Sunday brunches by the Euphrates, that their temporal innovations were somewhat incomplete from our perspective. But to think that would be to miss the truly profound and enduring legacy of Sumerian timekeeping? For despite not inventing the weekend, the Sumerians bequeathed to us, their distant historical descendants, some of the most fundamental ways we still measure, divide, and conceptualize time and space every single day. Their gift wasn't leisure time, but the very architecture of time itself. The most significant and far-reaching of these gifts is undoubtedly their sexagesimal, or base 60 numbering system. Our modern system of dividing hours into 60 minutes and minutes into 60 seconds, as well as the 360 degrees in a circle 6x60, is a direct legacy of this ancient Mesopotamian mathematical framework, developed first by the Sumerians and then adopted and greatly expanded upon by the later Babylonians, particularly for astronomical and mathematical calculations. Think about that for a moment. Every time you glance at your watch, every time you set an alarm, every time you navigate using degrees of latitude and longitude, you are using a system whose roots stretch back over 5,000 years to those clever scribes and priests in ancient Sumer. Why base 60? As we touched upon earlier, the precise cognitive or practical reasons why the Sumerians initially adopted or developed such a seemingly complex base 60 system, especially when they also used a simpler base 10 system for some everyday counting, remain a fascinating area of inquiry in the history of mathematics. One prominent theory suggests it arose from the desire to have a number that was easily divisible by many smaller integers. 60 can be evenly divided by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This high divisibility is incredibly useful for calculations involving fractions, for dividing things up fairly like rations or land, and for astronomical work involving cycles and portions of circles. Another theory posits it might have been a fusion of two earlier counting systems, perhaps one based on 5, the fingers of one hand, and another based on 12, perhaps related to finger joints or lunar cycles, with 5x12 Nakarn 60. Whatever its exact origin, its utility for complex calculations, especially in astronomy where they were dealing with cycles and parts of cycles, made it an incredibly powerful tool. While the Sumerians themselves didn't necessarily divide their daylight period into 12 fixed-length double hours of 60 minutes each, as the later Babylonians and Egyptians did their hours, or watches of the day and night, likely varied in length with the seasons, being longer in summer daylight and shorter in winter daylight, their development of the base 60 mathematical framework was the essential prerequisite for these later, more precise divisions of the day. They laid the mathematical foundation. The very idea of dividing a circle into 360 parts also likely stems from this Mesopotamian tradition, perhaps by analogy with the conceptual year of 360 days, 12 months of 30 days. A convenient approximation, with each day corresponding to 1 degree of the sun's apparent annual path through the heavens. Beyond the structure of our minutes, hours, and circles, the Sumerians gave us the very concept of a structured, written calendar itself. a system for organizing human activities in relation to celestial cycles. Their meticulous observation of the moon and sun, their development of named months, their invention of intercalation to reconcile lunar and solar time, these were monumental intellectual achievements that provided a framework for countless later civilizations. The idea that time could be systematically measured, recorded, predicted to some extent, and communally agreed upon was a revolutionary one, essential for the development of complex societies. Their tradition of meticulous astronomical observation and record keeping on cuneiform clay tablets, continued and greatly enhanced by the Babylonians, formed the bedrock of ancient astronomy. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the Babylonians, building directly upon these Sumerian foundations and using the sexagesimal system, developed incredibly sophisticated mathematical astronomy, creating extensive tables and predictive models for lunar and planetary movements, and even the ability to predict certain types of eclipses. This knowledge was later transmitted to the Greeks, who further developed it, and it ultimately flowed into Hellenistic, Indian, Islamic, and eventually European scientific traditions. So, in a very real sense, the path to modern astronomy, and all the timekeeping precision that comes with it, begins in those dusty Mesopotamian cities. When you check your highly accurate atomic clock-synchronized smartphone for the time, you're benefiting from a continuous intellectual lineage that started with the Sumerian priests squinting at the first crescent moon. So, while the Sumerians may not have figured out the weekend in a way we'd recognize, their society had different rhythms, different priorities, and a different understanding of work and rest, their contribution to how humanity understands. Measures and orders time is immeasurable. They didn't give us Saturdays off, but they gave us the seconds, minutes, and hours that allow us to even conceptualize such a schedule. They didn't invent the concept of a holiday, but they pioneered the very calendar that allows us to mark when our holidays begin. Their boring but essential work of counting days, tracking celestial bodies, and performing complex calculations on clay tablets has left an indelible mark on our world. Every time you divide a pizza into 6 or 12ths, every time you marvel at a perfectly constructed arch, they were masters of that too. And every time you check your watch, you're unknowingly paying homage to those ancient innovators in the land between the rivers. They may not have known how to relax on a Saturday morning, but they certainly knew how to make every second count. And for that, we owe them a debt of, well, a debt of time. And so, our sleepy sojourn in ancient Sumer, the land where time itself was first truly captured and organized, comes to its gentle end. We've walked the dusty streets of Uruk and Ur, gazed with priests from the tops of ziggurats at the moon and stars, and deciphered the wedge-shaped secrets of clay tablets. We've understood their need for order, their ingenious solutions to celestial puzzles, and why, for all their brilliance, the concept of a lazy weekend remained an undiscovered country. As the images of mud brick cities, fertile river plains, and diligent scribes begin to soften and fade into the mists of your mind, allow the gentle rhythms of this ancient world to lull you into a state of deep repose. The concerns of their calendar, the demands of their gods, the toil of their daily lives, these can all recede now, leaving behind only a quiet appreciation for their foundational contributions to our own understanding of time. There are no more lunar cycles to track tonight, no intercalary months to debate, only the smooth, steady passage into your own peaceful slumber. Let the knowledge of their achievements become a soft, comforting hum in the background of your thoughts. Feel the release of the day's own schedules and demands, and embrace the timeless present of this moment of rest. Your own internal clock is winding down, preparing you for a night of deep, restorative sleep. The legacy of Sumer is all around us, in every tick and every talk. But for now, let all measurements cease, and allow yourself to drift, unbound by hours or minutes, into the serene expanse of dreams. Sweet dreams.